Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 18, Chapter 13, the second half. Class started back up soon enough, and Izuku returned well-rested for the most part. He had a therapist appointment the day before, and he'd been able to get some dark stuff off his chest, and he felt mildly better because of it. As he stepped back into the classroom, he expected to feel overwhelmed by everyone, but the opposite ended up being true. As Izuku walked into the classroom and saw everyone happily talking to each other about their internships, a warm, comfortable feeling spread through his chest. That was new. Izuku walked over to Shoto's desk, almost without thinking about it. Ida was already there. "How are your guys' wounds?" he asked, standing by the desk. "I'm completely healed," Shoto said. "Ida said he still has problems with his arms, though." Ida shook his head, gesturing about. "I am fine. Do not worry for me. My wounds have healed well. What about you, Midoriya?" "My arm is almost completely better," Izuku answered, showing them the bandages peeking out from his uniform sleeve. "And my leg." "You three, right?" Izuku looked up at Kaminari's voice, pointed in their direction. He'd missed the entire first part of the conversation and had no idea what the electric guy was talking about. "Huh?" he said intelligently. "Oh yeah, the hero killer," Sero interjected from the other side of the room, hanging from Kachan's hand. "I'm glad you guys made it out alive, seriously," Kirishima added from Kachan's other hand. Izuku blinked. Kirishima was glad? Since when did people actually care about Izuku's well-being? When had the class started caring about him? "I was worried," Yaoyorozu said, and Izuku glanced over at her, eyes wide. She had been worried? What was going on here? "I heard Endeavor saved you, right?" Sato said, and Izuku turned to Shoto, lip curling up. Shoto only watched lazily. Izuku tuned the rest of the conversation out, until he caught wind of Kaminari saying something detestable, something good, about the hero killer, and his head shot up. "Kaminari!" Izuku growled. "Oh, Ida, sorry," he started, hand coming up to cover his bullshit-spouting mouth. "No, it's fine," Ida was quick to reassure. Izuku sighed, and then went to his seat. Kachan had taken his seat too, and while Ida was spouting quips, the blonde had turned to face Izuku. "I need to talk to you, Deku," he stated, his voice abnormally flat. "Okay," Izuku stuttered. "Well, after class today we can—" "Meet me outside after class," Kachan interrupted, before turning back around to ignore Izuku, who looked down at his hands nervously. After that, they headed down to Ground Gamma for hero basic training with All Might, changed into their hero costumes. Izuku's costume had been repaired relatively quickly after the fight with Stain, and he was glad. He liked his costume, and he enjoyed wearing it. They all gathered in a group in front of All Might, and Izuku stood next to Shoto, taking comfort in the boy's presence. Ida was to Izuku's left. Both of them were quite a bit taller than Izuku, and he felt protected, sandwiched between them. "Since you've all just gotten back from your internships, we'll have some fun with a rescue training race," All Might explained. Ida raised a hand, high above Izuku. "If we're doing rescue training, shouldn't we be doing it at the USJ?" A chill went down Izuku's spine at the mention of the USJ. That place had done nothing beneficial for Izuku's PTSD. "That place is for training with disasters," All Might explained. "This is a race. We're at Field Gamma, a dense area filled with factories laid out like an intricate labyrinth. You'll break up into 4 5-person groups and go through the training one group at a time. When I send out a distress signal from somewhere inside, you'll all start at once from the outskirts of the city." All Might smiled at them. "It's a race to see who will rescue me first. Of course, you'll have to keep damage to buildings to a minimum." The hero not so subtly pointed a finger at the explosive hero in training, and Izuku hid a smile in the folds of his hood. The first group got in place after that, and Izuku was part of it. Izuku jumped to his starting point, and he stood, looking out over all the metal. He could sense where every single one of the other students was, as well as where All Might was, with the help of his quirk. He couldn't see their auras, but he could sense where they were. Not that it really helped all that much in this particular race. Well, maybe knowing exactly where All Might was would help. Izuku was up against Ida, Ojiro, Ashido, and Sero. Several of them had quirks very suitable for traversing this type of environment. Izuku's plan was pretty foolproof, though, considering. He waited for the start signal, and then powered one for all through his entire body. He gave it half a second and then propelled himself upward and at an angle toward his mentor. Izuku flew through the air, his hair flowing behind him. A smile grew across his face. He really loved this feeling. The sensation of weightlessness and of the wind rushing through his hair was unparalleled to anything Izuku had experienced before. Izuku fell in a controlled descent, aiming for a silo-looking thing. He propelled himself upward again after touching down. The metal cracked under him unfortunately, but he ignored it, shooting upward. The second jump took him to where he could feel Yagi's presence, and he landed directly in front of him, a divot cracking in the pavement where his legs hit. Yagi looked at him, a brow raised. He leaned down to Izuku. "Your natural talent of one for all is astounding, my boy. What percentage was that?" he asked, presenting Izuku with a sash. "Almost 50, Izuku answered, accepting the sash that All Might offered him with embarrassment. Sero arrived then, grinning, not even winded. He moved to slap Izuku on the back, but paused when Izuku flinched back. He dropped his hand and instead said, "Great job, Midoriya." Izuku smiled and rubbed his hand through his windswept hair bashfully. After that, it barely took any time at all for the others to finish up the race. "Young Midoriya came in first, but compared to the beginning of the year, you've all gotten a lot better." All Might looked over the group, smiling. "Keep going like this and start preparing for your final exam." All Might dismissed everyone, and Izuku turned to leave with everyone else when Yagi's hand fell on his shoulder. Izuku turned around. "You did a wonderful job, young Izuku. Come find me after class is over," he said, turning away. Izuku raised a hand, frowning, wanting to mention that Kacchan had already asked to see him after class, but Yagi was already walking away. "The time has come, where I must tell you about me and One for All." Izuku watched his mentor's back, frowning. That seemed like a pretty important conversation. He would have to postpone the conversation with Kacchan. Maybe he would be willing to wait until Izuku finished with Yagi. Izuku approached the boy in the locker room after class once he was done dressing in his usual clothes. "Do you mind waiting for me? I have to go do something," he said. Kacchan glared at him, his eyes seemingly searching his own. Izuku tapped his fingers together hesitantly. "You better hurry up. I won't wait forever, Deku." Izuku nodded, relieved, and then left, rushing to the teacher's lounge, the door falling shut behind him. He found a very serious-looking Yagi sitting on the couch, his aura cold and gray. An electric feeling jolt of fear went through Izuku's body at the sight, and he unintentionally backed up. He had seen his father in similar, serious positions many times before the man randomly remembered that he hated Izuku and started hurting him. Yagi? Yagi looked up and seemed to catch the fear on Izuku's face because he suddenly stood. Izuku flinched, his back hitting the wall. Sorry, Izuku stuttered. You reminded me of my father. You looked... Izuku shook his head, looking down, picking at his nails furiously. His mentor leaned forward, a bit of warmth striking through his aura. "I'm sorry, my boy. May I hug you?" Izuku nodded hesitantly, and Yagi pulled the small boy against his chest. Izuku sighed. Yagi wasn't his father. He needed to realize that. He needed to be better. It really was 2 steps forward, 3 steps back with him. After some time, Izuku left, feeling stressed beyond measure and worried about his mentor. Something had gone left unsaid. He could tell. The man's aura had been darker than Izuku had ever seen it, and that scared him. Kacchan was waiting outside, on the steps leading into UA. He stood when Izuku approached him. "I hurt you," the explosive blonde started with as soon as Izuku was within conversing range. Izuku's foot stopped mid-step, and he blinked up at Kacchan. The boy in front of him seemed to take a big breath. His hands were fisted at his sides, and he glared at Izuku. "I hurt you a lot growing up. I know I did. I saw your face when I attacked you during the sports festival, and I heard your conversation with Half and Half." Izuku stiffened, inhaling sharply. You what?" he hissed. Kachan gritted his teeth before asking, "Your father abused you?" Izuku bit the inside of his cheek, his hands coming up around himself. He hated this conversation already. After what he'd spoken to Yagi about, Izuku couldn't take much more. "Yeah, he did. Is that all you wanted? Can I go now?" Izuku moved to turn away. "Wait, Deku!" Izuku looked back at his former bully, watching him inhale deeply. "Deku, I'm sorry." Izuku blinked, arms falling to his sides. "You're what?" Kachan scowled, looking away bitterly. "I'm not fucking repeating myself." You're sorry," Izuku whispered, heart pounding. You're fucking sorry?" Kachan looked back at Izuku, surprised. "You're angry? I thought you'd be happy I apologized." Izuku reached up to yank at his hair. "You have no idea what you did to me, Kachan. I was in hell at home, and then I was in hell at school too. You turned everyone against me." Izuku charged forward, jabbing a finger into the astonished boy's chest, tears bursting to life in his eyes. "I tried to kill myself when I was 11 years old, Kachan. Do you know what that's like? To have the entire world against you? I was hurting it alone. I was so alone." Izuku dropped his hand from Kachan's chest, wiping at his eyes. He shook his head. "I still have scars from you, Kachan. Burn scars from my father, and burn scars from you." He looked up at Kachan's slack-jawed expression. "Thank you for your apology, Kachan. It hurts all the time. Sorry isn't enough, it's not." "Deku." Izuku looked up at the voice, chest hitching with a stuttered breath. "I'm going to be better, okay?" "Okay," Izuku answered, and then turned and walked away, done with everything today. He screwed headphones into his ears and turned on one of his playlists, loud enough to try to drown out the thoughts in his head. He walked to the train station, his feet carrying him there with little input from his brain. Izuku closed his eyes on the way and let the music fill his head. He walked the rest of the way to the beach from the train station and then went to his secluded spot, practically collapsing into the sand. He curled up into his normal ball and watched the ocean. Izuku had no idea how much time had passed when his phone began ringing through his headphones in his ears. Izuku answered the call without looking at who it was that was calling him. "Hello?" he murmured flatly into his headphones. "Problem child, where are you?" Aizawa's voice asked. Izuku set his forehead on his knees. "I'm at the beach." "Why are you at the beach? It's almost 8 o'clock, Aizawa sighed. "Oh, it is?" Izuku asked absently. "All right, Midoriya. We're going to come pick you up," his teacher's voice said. "I'm depressed, Sensei," Izuku whispered. "Yeah, I got that," Aizawa answered tonelessly. It wasn't unkind, though. "Did something happen?" "Kachan apologized to me," Izuku said. "Bakugo?" "Mm-hmm," he answered, sighing. "We're almost there, Midoriya. Can you meet us by the road?" Aizawa requested. "Mm-hmm," he repeated. Izuku stood and headed for the road. After a minute, he caught sight of Mike's familiar American car and hung up, putting his headphones away. Mike was driving, and Aizawa got out to open the back door. Izuku stumbled into the seat, surprised to see Wink was there. She jumped onto his lap as he buckled and pulled her up to his chest, cuddling his face in her fur. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice muffled by fur. "It's no problem at all, little listener. If we don't take care of you, who will?" Mike exclaimed from the driver's seat. Izuku choked on his own air at the voice hero's words. He was right. The next day was actually going all right, but of course, nothing ever went well with Izuku for long. The world hated him. That much had been proven long ago. He was sitting with several classmates at lunch, sandwiched between Ida and Todoroki, as they had all been taking to doing recently. They were all discussing the upcoming final exams when something slammed into the back of Izuku's head, and he fell forward with a gasp. Immediately, every single person at the table was on their feet. Murderous gazes pointed at the boy who hit Izuku in the back of the head. You're from Class B, Todoroki snarled, one hand falling onto Izuku's shoulder. Monoma, Ida elaborated, his voice low, angry. How dare you? Uraraka growled from across Izuku. Izuku rubbed his head, several emotions warring inside of him. I heard you three met the hero killer, the blonde boy Monoma said, oblivious to the danger he was in. Just like at the sports festival, you guys in Class A have to have all the attention, huh? His voice was mocking and derogatory. Get away from us, Todoroki bit out from between gritted teeth, his fingers tightening on Izuku's shoulder, as if it was the only thing preventing him from decking the boy in front of him in the face. But that attention isn't because people have high hopes for you. It's because you keep attracting trouble, right? Monoma continued. Izuku stood slowly, nowhere near the height of his friends, but with twice the killer aura, and turned to face the piece of shit. You are insignificant. Izuku's voice was low and forced, as if he was only just barely holding himself back. Monoma must have finally sensed the danger because he took a half a step back. If you don't walk away right now, I promise you, Monoma, that you will consider yourself lucky if you live to regret ever speaking down to us. Izuku was staring into the blonde's eyes as the boy grew several shades paler as he registered the threat. Class B's rep came then and took him away, apologizing for his behavior for him. Monoma didn't even struggle. Izuku turned away and sat back down, stuffing rice into his mouth. The others remained standing, looking down at their resident cinnamon roll in absolute shock. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Todoroki finally said, releasing Izuku's shoulder and taking a seat back next to him. I will not allow people to bully me or the people I care about any more. I'm done with that, Izuku hissed. Aw, Mito, Uraraka voiced, sitting down as well. Izuku looked up, trying to calm himself. Mito? Yeah, Uraraka smiled. Deku doesn't seem right to call you anymore, and I heard Sue refer to you as Mito. Do you mind it? Izuku smiled lightly. It's nice, he said. Uraraka grinned at him. That afternoon after class, Izuku finally had that meeting with Shinso, out of class at a cat cafe. Apparently the purple-haired boy really liked cats as well. Izuku sat on the floor and let the felines crowd him, crawling all over him. One settled across the back of his neck like a scarf. Shinso sat in a low seat next to Izuku. One small cat perched on his lap, staring at him intently. So, sorry for what I said at the sports festival, Shinso began blandly, hand running the fur of the gray-striped cat on his lap. Izuku tilted his head, giving the boy a smile. It's all right. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I think your quirk is awesome and incredibly useful for hero work, and that the quirk does not define the person, actions do. And words too. But definitely not quirks. Shinso made a face. That was a lot all at once, Midoriya. Izuku shrugged, looking down. I'm still not great at social interactions, but the sentiment remains the same. Shinso continued to pet the cat for a minute. Before standing up to order a drink, Izuku went with him. You like the triple espresso too? Shinso asked, raising an eyebrow at him. Oh, definitely, Izuku said, paying. Nothing like a cup of espresso for the depresso. Shinso scoffed and then paid for his own. They waited a minute and then went and sat back down in their original spots, now with their go-juice. Izuku sighed, relaxing against the wall, glad to have a cup of coffee in one hand and a soft cat in the other. I was bullied a lot because of my quirk, Shinso murmured, taking a sip from his coffee, looking away from Izuku. I guess I eventually fell into a similar mindset, judging people for their quirks. Mm-hmm. Izuku bit the inside of his cheek before deciding to add his own experience. I was considered quirkless until I was 10. Shinso looked at him in surprise, and Izuku nodded. And then even after it came in, I refused to use it. So then, I was still bullied for being quirkless. But why would you do that? Your quirk is so great. Shinso seemed genuinely confused. Izuku frowned, brow furrowing. One of the cats jumped back onto Izuku's neck, tail wrapping around him. I scared my mom with it, Izuku said. Among other reasons. Those kept me from using it. Shinso seemed to be looking at him carefully. I saw your arms, at the sports festival, when you were getting your medal. Shinso was gauging his reaction while Izuku took a burning gulp from his espresso and then almost did a spit take. I'm not going to presume anything, but are you safe wherever you're living, Midoriya? Izuku looked up in shock, sputtering, eyes wide as plates. Why? Shinso quirked his mouth up at Izuku. You're not used to people caring about you, are you, Midoriya? Izuku's shoulders curled into himself bashfully before saying, I'm safe, Shinso. Thank you. After that, Izuku spent all his extra time before the written exam studying. When those finally came, Izuku was pretty confident in his answers. Those took 3 long, painful days. Izuku hated taking tests, but he usually did pretty well. The next day was the day of the practical exam, and Izuku was nervous. Most people thought it would be robots again, like at the entrance exam. Izuku wasn't so sure, though other upperclassmen had said that's what they did, so maybe Izuku was worried for nothing. All the students gathered in their hero costumes across from way too many teachers for them to actually be facing robots. Izuku was proven correct when Principal Nezu climbed out of Aizawa's scarf and scaled down his body like a mountain climber, proceeding to explain what would actually be happening. They would be fighting the teachers. Teams were made, and Izuku looked up when his name was said, in conjunction with Shinso's. The two glanced at each other, Shinso stepping closer to him, and Izuku tilted his head, mind going a mile a minute. Or it was until it froze at the sight of All Might leaping down and landing in front of them, the ground splintering. Izuku blinked rapidly, disbelieving. Shinso's hand dropped onto Izuku's shoulder. Welp, it was nice knowing you, Midoriya. Izuku turned away from All Might and toward Shinso. I have an idea, he said. Theirs ended up being the last match planned, so Izuku had plenty of time to go over his idea with Shinso in private. Can you keep a secret? He asked his partner. Shinso raised a brow at him. Of course I can, he answered. Okay, so, similar to how Aizawa's been training you, All Might has been training me for a while. Shinso's eyes widened. We've become close, I would say. Shinso leaned back against the wall of the viewing room. Recovery Girl was there, but there was nothing to hide from her. How is this relevant? He asked. Izuku smiled evilly. For you to activate your quirk on someone, they need to answer you directly, right? The purple-haired boy nodded, confused. Izuku's eyes shined as he continued. All Might probably knows that, since Mike announced it during the sports festival, so he'll know not to speak to you. But, depending on how well you can act, if you frantically run up to him, shouting that I'm hurt or something, I'm sure he will answer you. Midoriya, that's pretty messed up. Shinso suddenly matched Izuku's wolfish grin. I love it. And as a backup plan, pretty much, I think we should just leg it. Izuku shrugged. Shinso nodded. That's cool with me. And with that, Uraraka joined them, and they watched the rest of the matches. Izuku leaned forward suddenly, though, during Mike's match, catching sight of what Jiro and Kota planned to do. Oh no, he whispered, hands gripping the table. What? Shinso asked lazily from next to Izuku. Mike is entomophobic, Izuku murmured. What's entomophobia? Uraraka asked. A phobia of bugs, Shinso answered before asking. Present Mike is? How do you know that? Shinso frowned, looking at him in confusion. Izuku blinked, remembering a night some time back when Izuku had been sitting next to the voice hero on the couch while they both did classwork. Izuku had absently pointed out a spider crawling across the floor toward them, and Mike had screamed so loud that the windows had rattled in their hinges, and Wink had gone running. The man had leapt onto the back of the couch, yelling for Sho, who had come running, quirk activated and bed marks on his face, capture scarf gripped in his hands. Mike hadn't gotten off the back of the couch until Aizawa had picked the spider up with his bare hand and placed it far outside. I just do, he answered lamely, watching the screen intently as the ground cracked by the voice hero's feet and he looked down. Izuku winced as the ground burst outward with hundreds of insects that swarmed the hero immediately. Mike was visibly traumatized, reeling backward, screaming. Despite them watching from so far away, Izuku could hear Mike's loud voice as he drew back, feeling for the man. Izuku watched as Mike fainted, crawling with bugs, and his classmates ran through the gate, Koda carrying Jiro. Izuku looked at Mike on the screen with sympathy. He was sure he would be a mess tonight. Eventually, the rest of the matches ended, and Hitoshi and Midoriya walked into the urban area where their match would be taking place. Midoriya nodded to Hitoshi. "I'm going to let you approach him," he whispered to him. "I'll stay hidden, though, and keep an eye on everything so that I can get you out if anything goes wrong." Hitoshi nodded in answer, and watched as Midoriya walked away, pausing once to look back, lips thin. "All might watch me die at the USJ because of my quirk. If you mention that I'm bleeding from my eyes or something, I have no doubt you'll get a response." "Damn, Midoriya. You're all for the low blows, aren't you?" Midoriya shrugged. "Whatever works," and then moved to continue walking away. He'd barely taken a step when he was suddenly blown backward by an insane amount of wind pressure, almost knocking him down. Recovering his balance, Midoriya nodded for him to get moving, as he himself seemed to dissolve into the natural shadows of the buildings. Obliging, Hitoshi started running toward the direction the wind had come from, trying to appear as scared and upset as possible, which was actually harder than he had originally thought it would be, as he was generally an apathetic person. He must have been somewhat convincing, though, because as soon as he got in All Might's line of sight, the hero's eyes widened in concern. "All Might!" Hitoshi yelled. All Might did not answer, jaw tightening, preparing to launch the boy into a building with a raised fist. "Wait!" Hitoshi screeched. "It's Midoriya! He's hurt! His eyes are bleeding and he's not moving!" All Might straightened, eyes turning wide and worried. "What? Where is—" "Lower your hand and walk over to me," Hitoshi commanded, and All Might's eyes glazed over, his jaw slackening. "Wow, that's weird," Midoriya said, appearing out of the shadows as All Might walked toward him. Hitoshi nodded, unnerved as well to see Japan's #1 hero under his control so easily. "I didn't think he'd actually fall for it," Midoriya mumbled, looking up at All Might with a strange expression. All Might stopped in front of Hitoshi, and Midoriya leaned down, pulling the yellow handcuffs from his belt and wrapping one cuff around All Might's wrist. He grinned at Hitoshi as the cuff clicked closed. "Team Midoriya and Shinso have passed," the robotic voice exclaimed, and Shinso released his hold on All Might, who blinked rapidly, his expression sour. "That was uncomfortable," the hero muttered, holding up his arm and looking at the handcuff hanging from his wrist, then passed it at Izuku. "That was your plan, wasn't it?" Izuku nodded, shamefaced. "I have to say I did not expect that. I was going to go the entire match without speaking. Good job, you two. Great teamwork. I'm proud of you." Izuku audibly choked on his saliva at those last 4 words, bending at the waist and hacking. Shinso leaned over, patting his back while All Might laughed. Izuku didn't think he would ever get used to being told that someone was proud of him, especially not by All Might himself. Izuku had to take the train back to the Yamada Aizawa household that evening after the exams. He had a feeling he knew why and had the foresight to stop and grab extra eye drops on his way back from the train station. Izuku was proven correct when he approached the apartment door and could hear Mike yelling, even without his quirk activated. He bet Aizawa was erasing it and decided it was probably a good idea he'd gotten the eye drops. Unlocking the door with the key he'd been given, Izuku headed into the apartment. The yelling was louder inside over the sound of water running. Izuku walked forward, setting his bag by the couch and moving down the hallway toward the closed bathroom door. He gently rapped on it with his knuckles. "Mike, you okay?" he called. "We're fine, Midoriya," Aizawa returned, his deep voice stressed. "I can still feel them on me!" Mike screeched. Izuku winced. "I brought eye drops," he said through the door. A barely audible voice said, "Thank fuck," and then the door opened a crack, steam billowing out as Aizawa appeared, wearing a sopping black t-shirt and boxers. His eyes were extremely red and his hair was a disaster. He stuck his hand through the crack in the door, making grabby motions with it. Izuku pressed the small bottle into his outstretched hand, and Aizawa took it wordlessly, slamming the door shut. Blinking, Izuku turned, heading to the couch and falling onto it with a sigh. All in all, the day had been relatively laid back. His match with All Might hadn't been difficult, and the rest of the day had gone smoothly. He was glad to have finally had a day where nothing horrible had happened, a day where his mental illnesses hadn't gotten the better of him and he'd been able to be a teenager for once. He hoped it could continue. After all, he had agreed to go to the mall tomorrow with his friends. What could go wrong? All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 13 of State of Mind. Chapter 14 will be up next. We're approaching the halfway point of this fic. I hope you all are enjoying it so far. Please leave those thoughts and reactions below, because there was a lot to this second half of this chapter. We get an apology from Bakugo. We get Izuku fighting with All Might. Shinso and Izuku developing a friendship. So there's a lot of cool components that happened here. And of course, Mike being petrified of bugs. So please let me know what you all thought. And as always, thank you so much for listening.